What if the very dirt you were discarded upon held enough wealth to buy the city that threw you out? 68-year-old Ruth Gable lost everything to a ruthless banking conglomerate, banished to a collapsing shack over an exhausted 19th-century mine. But the frozen earth was hiding a billion-dollar secret. The eviction notice nailed to the front door of Ruth Gable's modest suburban home in Rapid City didn't just smell of cheap adhesive and fresh ink. It reeked of profound systemic cruelty. At 68, Ruth was entirely alone. Her husband, Frank, had passed away 8 months prior after a grueling 3-year battle with pancreatic cancer. Frank had been a good man, a retired mechanic who worked his hands to the bone, but even a lifetime of honest labor was no match for the predatory American healthcare system. To pay for the experimental treatments at the Mayo Clinic, they had mortgaged everything. When Frank's heart finally gave out, the medical debt remained a staggering, suffocating anchor that pulled Ruth under. The bank didn't care that she had lived in that house for 40 years. They didn't care about the rose bushes she had planted in the spring of 1985, or the faint pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe where they had measured their late son's height before he was lost in a tragic car accident decades ago. To the executives at the local branch of Wells Fargo, and specifically to the sneering asset manager named Harrison Caldwell, Ruth was just a negative integer on a quarterly spreadsheet. "You have until 5 p.m. on Friday to vacate the premises, Mrs. Gable," Caldwell had said, standing on her porch in a tailored wool suit that cost more than her car. His voice held the false, practiced sympathy of an undertaker. "The bank has already found a buyer for the lot. They plan to bulldoze the property on Monday." Ruth hadn't wept. She was too hollowed out for tears. She packed her life into 4 cardboard boxes and loaded them into the rusted bed of Frank's 1998 Ford Ranger. She had nowhere to go. The only asset the bank hadn't seized was a completely worthless 40-acre tract of land deep in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Frank had bought it at a county tax auction for $300 in the late 90s, as a joke. The property was home to the Iron Tooth, an abandoned prospector's claim from the 1880s. Decades ago, the legendary Homestake Mining Company, the behemoth that had pulled over 40 million ounces of gold from the Black Hills, had surveyed the Iron Tooth. Their geologists had declared it totally barren, a geological dead end. The land was so steep-rocky and utterly devoid of timber that even the state ignored it. There was a dilapidated, rotting miner's cabin perched directly over the main shaft, and that was it. No running water, no electricity, just the biting wind of the Dakotas. When Ruth's truck tires finally crunched onto the overgrown, washed-out dirt road leading to the Iron Tooth, a profound wave of despair washed over her. The cabin was a tragedy of grey, splintering wood. Half of the roof had caved in under the weight of previous winters. The front door hung on a single rusted hinge. Beyond the cabin lay the dark, gaping maw of the mine's entrance, barred by heavy iron grating that had rusted into brittle, jagged teeth. Stepping out into the biting November wind, Ruth wrapped her threadbare wool coat tighter around her frail shoulders. "Well, Frank," she whispered, her breath pluming in the freezing air, "you always said we'd retire to the mountains." The first few weeks were a brutal test of human endurance. Ruth was a suburban grandmother, not a frontier survivalist. She spent her days patching the holes in the roof with torn pieces of tarp and discarded tin she found scattered around the property. She hauled water from a partially frozen creek a mile down the mountain, boiling it over a small, rusted wood stove that sat in the center of the cabin. Her hands, once soft and prone to knitting, became calloused, blistered, and cracked. Her diet consisted of canned beans and stale crackers bought with the meager remnants of her Social Security check, but the physical toll was nothing compared to the psychological terror. The abandoned mine beneath her feet seemed to breathe. At night, when the wind howled through the canyons, the air pressure inside the subterranean tunnels would shift, sending deep, low moans echoing up through the floorboards of the cabin. It sounded like the ghosts of desperate men trapped in the dark. Ruth tried to ignore the mine. The local zoning authority had classified it as an extreme hazard. The timbers holding up the tunnels were well over a century old, completely rotted through. But as November bled into December, a brutal blizzard descended upon the Black Hills, dumping 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours. The temperature plummeted to 15 below zero. Ruth's meager pile of scavenged firewood was gone within 2 days. Shivering violently under 3 moth-eaten blankets, Ruth realized a terrifying truth. If she didn't find fuel, she would freeze to death in her sleep. There was only one place left to get dry wood: the mine. Armed with an industrial flashlight that Frank had kept in the truck and a rusted crowbar, Ruth pried open the heavy cellar door in the floor of the cabin. The stairs leading down into the dark were steep and treacherous. The smell of damp earth ozone and ancient decay washed over her. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy oak door separated the cellar from the actual mine shaft. It had been boarded up, but the wood was so rotted, Ruth easily smashed through it with the crowbar. She stepped into the iron tooth. The tunnel was cavernous, held up by massive 12 by 12 pine beams. True to her desperate hopes, the ground was littered with broken timbers, old wooden crates, and dry, splintered debris left behind by miners a century ago. It was a gold mine of firewood. Ruth began gathering the wood her flashlight, cutting through the oppressive, dusty darkness. She walked deeper into the tunnel, perhaps 50 yards, completely oblivious to the danger above her. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed through the shaft. The earth above her groaned violently. The blizzard had dropped tons of heavy snow directly over a weak spot in the mountain's crust. Before Ruth could even turn around, the ceiling, 20 yards behind her, gave way. Tons of jagged rock, shale, and freezing mud crashed down into the tunnel with the force of an exploding bomb. The shockwave knocked Ruth off her feet, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Her flashlight skittered away, its beam bouncing crazily against the walls. A massive cloud of choking dust filled the air. Coughing wildly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Ruth blindly reached out and grabbed the flashlight. She scrambled to her feet and pointed the beam back toward the entrance. Her blood ran cold. The tunnel was completely blocked. A massive wall of collapsed rock had sealed her in. She was buried alive 80 feet below the surface of the earth. Panic is a cold, suffocating thing. It gripped Ruth's chest, making it impossible to breathe. She rushed at the collapsed wall of rock, tearing at the heavy stones with her bare, bleeding hands. "Help!" she screamed, her voice cracking, absorbed instantly by the dense, uncaring earth. "Somebody help me!" But there was no one for 50 miles. There was only the darkness, the dust, and the freezing silence. After an hour of frantic, useless digging, exhaustion finally overtook her. She collapsed against the tunnel wall, her fingernails broken and bleeding. She was going to die down here. The bank had taken her home, the cancer had taken her husband, and now this forgotten hole in the earth was going to serve as her tomb. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. But as she sat there in the gloom, her flashlight beam illuminating the freshly exposed rock of the cave-in, something caught her eye. The collapse hadn't just blocked the tunnel, it had sheared off a massive section of the side wall, exposing rock that hadn't seen the light of day since the earth's crust cooled. Amidst the grey shale and dull, dusty quartz, there was a strange, jagged vein running straight down the center of the newly exposed rock face. It was thick, maybe 3 feet wide, and it didn't look like normal stone. It looked like a brutal, violent scar in the earth, and it was glittering. Ruth frowned, wiping the dirt from her tear-streaked face. She crawled closer, shining the beam directly onto the exposed vein. The light didn't just bounce off, it ignited. Ribbons of heavy, dull yellow metal were deeply embedded in the white quartz, twisting and weaving like golden roots. Frank had been an amateur rockhound. He used to drag Ruth to gem shows in Denver and read thick books on geology. She remembered the distinct difference between the flaky, brittle, brassy look of iron pyrite fool's gold and the real thing. Pyrite was sharp, cubic, and chipped when struck. With trembling hands, Ruth picked up her crowbar. She swung it hard against the glittering vein. The metal didn't shatter or spark. The crowbar sank into it slightly with a dull, heavy thud. It was soft. It was malleable. Ruth chipped off a piece of the rock the size of her fist. It weighed nearly 3 pounds. It was impossibly dense. The yellow ribbons running through it were thick and pure. Homestakes geologists in the 1920s hadn't missed the gold because they were stupid. They had missed it because the Iron Tooth's true vein didn't follow the normal geological fault lines of the Black Hills. The gold wasn't in the original tunnel. It was buried behind 30 feet of solid, barren shale, only exposed because the freak blizzard had triggered a structural collapse. Ruth stared at the rock in her hands. The fear of death was suddenly replaced by a surge of overwhelming, terrifying adrenaline. She wasn't looking at a few flakes. If this vein ran as deep as the mountain, and it appeared to plunge straight down into the bedrock, she was sitting on top of one of the richest undiscovered gold deposits in North American history. But none of it mattered if she couldn't get out. Adrenaline sharpening her mind, Ruth turned the flashlight away from the gold and examined the collapse again. The ceiling had fallen, but the top of the debris pile didn't touch the roof of the tunnel. There was a gap perhaps 2 feet wide near the crown of the shaft. It was a perilous climb over unstable, shifting rocks. But it was her only chance. Strapping the heavy gold-laced rock into the pockets of her oversized coat, Ruth began to climb. The rocks shifted terrifyingly beneath her boots. Several times her foot punched through, sending cascades of rubble down into the darkness. She scraped her knees, tore her coat, and nearly lost her grip, but the image of Harrison Caldwell's smug face at her front door fueled her. She clawed her way to the top of the pile, squeezed her frail body through the narrow gap, and tumbled down the other side, crashing onto the wooden floor of the cellar. She lay there for a long time, gasping for the freezing air, the heavy rock pressing against her ribs. She had survived. 3 days later, the blizzard broke, and the snowplows finally cleared the main highway. Ruth had survived on melted snow and half a jar of peanut butter. With her prize securely wrapped in an old towel, she climbed into her rusted Ford Ranger, the engine barely turning over in the bitter cold. She didn't go to a corporate assay office. She knew that the moment a major discovery was logged, the sharks would circle. A lone elderly widow sitting on unsurveyed mineral rights was a prime target for predatory eminent domain lawsuits or hostile land grabs. She drove to a gritty industrial strip mall on the outskirts of Rapid City, pulling up to a dusty storefront with a neon sign that read, "Black Hills Pawn and Assay." The bell above the door jingled. The man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow with a greying beard and grease-stained hands named Martin, barely looked up from his ledger. "If you're hawking silverware, lady, I'm paying 10% under spot," he grunted. Ruth didn't speak. She walked to the counter, unwrapped the towel, and placed the heavy rock onto the glass display case. It landed with a dense, authoritative thud. Martin froze. He looked at the rock, then slowly looked up at Ruth, his eyes narrowing. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket and screwed it into his right eye. He picked up the rock, his arm muscles flexing slightly at the unexpected weight. He carried it to a back table, under a high-intensity halogen lamp. Ruth watched his reflection in the mirror behind the counter. She saw him scrape the yellow ribbon with a steel pick. She saw him apply a drop of nitric acid from a small glass vial. The metal didn't dissolve. It didn't fizz. It just gleamed perfectly, brilliantly yellow. When Martin turned back around, his entire demeanor had changed. The indifference was gone, replaced by a twitchy, predatory slickness. "Well now," Martin said, licking his lips. His voice was suddenly very smooth. "It's a nice little chunk of ore. Low purity, though. Mostly quartz and some base metals. I'll do you a favor, seeing as it's close to the holidays. I'll give you $500 cash for it right now. No paperwork." Ruth Gable might have been old, and she might have been tired, but she wasn't a fool. She knew what she had seen under that acid drop. "I'll take it back, thank you," Ruth said quietly, reaching for the rock. Martin's thick hand slammed down over the stone, pinning it to the counter. His eyes hardened, entirely devoid of warmth. "Lady, you walk out of here with this, and the wrong people find out you have it, you'll end up dead in a ditch. I'm offering you a clean break." Ruth stared at the heavy hand, pinning her future to the glass. She slowly reached into her oversized coat pocket and pulled out the heavy, rusted iron crowbar she had used to survive the mine, resting it gently on the glass counter next to Martin's fingers. "Remove your hand, Martin," Ruth said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper that echoed with the weight of everything she had lost. "Or I will break every bone in it and take my property anyway." Martin looked at the iron bar, then at the blazing, unyielding fire in the elderly widow's eyes. Slowly he lifted his hand. Ruth wrapped the gold back in the towel, placed it in her bag, and walked out into the freezing South Dakota sun. She had her proof. Now she needed an army. She was going to make the people who ruined her life pay, and she knew exactly where to start. The icy wind whipped across the cracked pavement of the industrial park as Ruth Gable climbed back into her rusted Ford Ranger. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, echoing the terrifying reality of what she carried in her canvas tote bag. She knew men had been murdered for fractions of an ounce of gold in the Black Hills, and she was carrying a dense block of pure subterranean wealth. More importantly, she knew that Martin the pawnbroker would not keep quiet. Predators recognized predators, and Martin possessed the exact kind of greasy ambition that would lead him straight to the very people who had ruined her life. Ruth was right. Less than 20 minutes after she drove away, Martin was on the phone. He bypassed the local police and independent assayers dialing a direct number to the executive branch of Wells Fargo in downtown Rapid City. He asked for Harrison Caldwell. Martin knew the asset manager well. They had collaborated on several quiet foreclosures where Martin bought seized jewelry at a fraction of its auction value. When Caldwell answered, irritated by the interruption, Martin wasted no time outlining the dirty, glittering truth about the Iron Tooth mine. The bank had evicted an old widow to steal a suburban house, completely ignoring the fact that they had left her sitting on top of an unmapped mesothermal gold vein that could rival the legendary Homestake deposit. Caldwell hung up the phone, the color draining from his meticulously tanned face. He immediately pulled up the property records for the Iron Tooth. The 40 acres had been classified as a Class 4 hazardous environmental liability, a designation meant to keep corporate entities from being sued when old tunnels collapsed. In his arrogance, Caldwell had expedited the transfer of that specific parcel back to Ruth during the eviction, viewing it as a garbage disposal tactic to saddle her with property taxes she could never pay. Now that clerical cruelty was a billion-dollar mistake, Caldwell did not hesitate. He summoned a team of corporate litigators and immediately filed a fraudulent emergency injunction with the South Dakota District Court. The paperwork claimed that a clerical error during the foreclosure proceedings had incorrectly severed the Iron Tooth parcel from the primary suburban estate. Furthermore, Caldwell hired a private security firm, Blackwater-trained contractors operating out of Cheyenne, to block the public access road leading to the mine, intending to starve Ruth out before she could legally register her mineral find with the Bureau of Land Management. But Caldwell severely underestimated the sheer hardened willpower of a woman who had already lost everything she loved. Instead of returning to the freezing cabin, Ruth drove her rattling truck straight into the heart of Rapid City. She bypassed the gleaming glass-fronted corporate law firms on Main Street. She knew those men. They went to country clubs with Harrison Caldwell. Instead, she navigated to a dilapidated brick building wedged between a bowling alley and a failing hardware store. A faded brass plaque on the door read, "Gregory Finch Attorney at Law, Land Disputes and Mineral Rights." Gregory Finch was a brilliant, cynical man in his late 50s, whose career at a major corporate firm had imploded a decade ago due to a relentless, uncompromising moral compass that alienated wealthy clients. When Ruth walked into his office, smelling of wood smoke, damp earth, and exhaustion, Finch barely looked up from his messy desk. "Consultations are $200, Mrs. Gable," Finch muttered, noting her frayed coat and trembling hands. "And if you are fighting a bank eviction, I am sorry, but the statute of limitations for an appeal is incredibly narrow in this state." Ruth did not say a word. She unzipped her canvas tote, reached inside, and placed the heavy quartz-veined rock directly onto the center of his desk. The dull thud rattled his coffee mug. Finch stopped breathing. He slowly stood up, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He had spent his early 20s as a field geologist for the Bureau of Land Management before attending law school. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He pulled a small magnifying glass from his drawer and leaned over the rock, his eyes tracing the thick, buttery yellow ribbons of raw gold violently twisting through the quartz. "Where did you find this?" Finch whispered, his voice trembling slightly. 80 feet below the floorboards of the rotting cabin Wells Fargo left me to die in. Ruth replied, her voice as hard and cold as the Dakota winter. "Harrison Caldwell evicted me to seize my husband's house. I want to register this claim, Finch, and then I want to legally bury them." Finch quickly moved to his filing cabinets, pulling out vast, rolled-up topographical maps of the Black Hills. "If you found this at the Iron Tooth, it means the old prospectors stopped digging 30 feet too early. You found a blind vein. But Ruth, you need to understand the danger you are in. The moment we file a formal mineral discovery claim, the assay office publishes it. The bank will realize what they lost. They will drown you in litigation. They will claim environmental hazard liens, clerical errors, anything to seize the land back." "They already know," Ruth said stoically. "The pawn shop owner I showed it to called Caldwell. I am certain of it." Finch cursed under his breath, immediately grabbing his coat and a thick leather briefcase. "Then we have hours, not days. We are going to the federal courthouse right now. If Caldwell is smart, he is already filing a state-level injunction to freeze your deed." The showdown occurred exactly 3 days later in the oak-paneled courtroom of the United States District Court in Pierre, South Dakota. Harrison Caldwell arrived flanked by 4 high-priced corporate attorneys in custom suits carrying boxes of meticulously forged environmental liability claims. Caldwell looked smug, confident that the sheer weight of a major banking institution would immediately crush the tired elderly widow sitting at the plaintiff's table. Ruth sat perfectly upright, wearing a borrowed grey suit from a local thrift store. Beside her, Gregory Finch looked like a man who had not slept in 72 hours, his desk littered with centuries-old leather-bound ledgers and dusty land patents. The presiding judge, an austere woman, named Honorable Margaret Vance. Wait, Honorable Margaret Hastings banged her gavel-demanding order. Caldwell's lead attorney stood up immediately, launching into a rehearsed, slippery monologue. Your Honor, the bank merely seeks to correct an administrative oversight. The attorney purred, refusing to look at Ruth. The property known as the Iron Tooth was transferred to Mrs. Gable under false pretenses regarding its environmental safety. Furthermore, there is an outstanding secondary lien from her late husband's medical debts. We are simply asking the court to freeze the deed and return the property to the bank's management trust until the debts are settled. Judge Hastings frowned, looking over the paperwork. In the state of South Dakota, banks wielded terrifying legislative power, and the injunction looked legally sound on the surface. Mr. Finch, the judge said, looking at the rumpled lawyer. The bank's injunction to freeze your client's assets appears valid under standard foreclosure recuperation laws. What is your defense? Finch stood up slowly, a dangerous, wolfish grin spreading across his face. He did not address the judge immediately. He turned to look directly at Harrison Caldwell. Your Honor, the bank's injunction is entirely irrelevant, Finch stated smoothly, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. Because Wells Fargo is attempting to seize something that does not exist under state jurisdiction, Caldwell sneered. The land is registered in the county Finch. Stop playing games. The surface land is registered in the county Mister, Caldwell Thenor. Finch corrected, pulling a fragile yellow document encased in a protective plastic sleeve from his briefcase. He walked it to the judge's bench. Your Honor, when Frank Gable purchased the Iron Tooth at a tax auction in 1998, he did not just buy the 40 acres of dirt. He bought the defunct corporate shell of the original mining company. Finch turned to the courtroom, holding up a certified copy of the document. This is a patented mining claim issued and signed by President Ulysses S. Grant in 1874. Under the General Mining Act of 1872, a patented claim completely severs the subterranean mineral rights from the surface estate. The federal government granted absolute untouchable ownership of the earth beneath the Iron Tooth to the claim holder. State courts, local banks, and county liens have absolutely zero legal jurisdiction over federal patented claims. The courtroom went dead silent. Caldwell's smug expression vanished, replaced by a pale, sickly terror. He furiously whispered to his lead attorney, who frantically began flipping through thick legal textbooks, visibly sweating. Furthermore, Finch continued, his voice rising with righteous authority. My client, Mrs. Gable, formally filed her discovery of a major mesothermal gold vein with the Federal Bureau of Land Management yesterday morning. The vein is estimated to hold upwards of $1.2 billion in raw ore. Because Mr. Caldwell deployed armed private contractors to blockade a federally protected mining claim, he has committed a Class A federal felony. We are not just asking you to dismiss the bank's injunction, Your Honor. We are filing immediate charges of federal land fraud extortion and armed trespass against Harrison Caldwell and his institution. Judge Hastings stared at the 1874 document, a rare smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She looked down at Caldwell, who was now trembling visibly, his career and freedom evaporating in real time. The bank's injunction is dismissed with extreme prejudice. Judge Hastings slammed her gavel down, the sound ringing like a gunshot. And I highly suggest Mr. Caldwell seek federal criminal counsel immediately. Ruth Gable closed her eyes, releasing a breath she felt she had been holding since her husband died. The crushing weight of the world, the debts, the fear, and the freezing dark of the mine had finally lifted. She had won. 6 months later, the quiet Black Hills were abuzz with industry. but entirely under Ruth's control. She refused to sell the land to any corporate entity.